The Louisiana swamps have always carried a certain weight in the human imagination. At dusk, when the last streaks of sunlight fade behind the cypress trees, the marshland transforms into something almost otherworldly. The air grows heavy, not just with the suffocating humidity that clings to the skin, but with a stillness that feels deliberate, as though the swamp itself were holding its breath. Dragonflies dart in sudden flashes of iridescence, mosquitoes rise in swarms like dark clouds, and beneath the surface, unseen things stir. The water does not reflect clearly. It ripples and distorts, hiding more than it reveals, as though it resists giving away its secrets. To walk here at twilight is to step into a space where human senses falter, where sound travels strangely and every shadow feels alive. It was against this backdrop in the year 1838 that 6 children vanished without a trace. They were ordinary in every sense, daughters and sons of families both privileged and poor, drawn from the different worlds of New Orleans. Yet their fates became bound together in a single chilling event that would haunt the city for generations. On a warm September evening, just as the light faded from the sky, they walked into the swamp. No one could say why. No one could explain how. What is certain is this: none of them ever returned. Days later, their shoes were found, small, mud-streaked, carefully arranged in a near-perfect line along the edge of the bayou. Not scattered, not lost, but placed as if in ritual. And yet, there were no footprints, no disturbed soil, no drag marks leading deeper into the reeds. It was as though the children had stepped neatly out of their shoes and simply disappeared. Search parties combed the swampland with lanterns, their lights flickering against the trees. Dogs sniffed the air but would not go forward, whining at the edge of the water before retreating. Nothing was found. No bodies, no clothing, no answers. In the weeks that followed, explanations clashed. Priests spoke of divine punishment, of restless spirits lurking in the bayou, forever hungry for innocence. Doctors dismissed such talk, pointing instead to disease, to the delirium of fever, to madness spreading like contagion through fragile minds. Parents argued in hushed voices, torn between the rational and the unexplainable. Was this the act of a hidden predator, a human monster moving in shadows? Or was it something far older, something that had lived in the swamps long before the city was ever built? This is not merely a story of missing children. It is a story caught between opposites. The innocence of childhood set against the swamp's primal darkness, reason against superstition, history against myth. The truth lies somewhere in the murk, if it can be said to lie anywhere at all. What compelled those 6 children to walk into the swamp together? And why, after all these years, has not a single body ever been recovered? New Orleans in 1838 was a city of contradictions, a place where splendor and decay existed side by side. On the wide boulevards, gas lamps flickered against the polished facades of Creole mansions, where families spoke French at their tables and kept music alive in their salons. But beyond the grand balconies with their curling ironwork lay cramped tenements filled with immigrants, Irish dock workers, German craftsmen, and free people of color who struggled to survive in a city that seemed to thrive on both prosperity and desperation. The Mississippi River carried goods and wealth into the city, but it also carried disease, bringing with it the fever that haunted every summer. In the air hung not only the scent of jasmine and magnolia, but also the sour trace of sewage and the constant restless noise of a port city in transition. It was in this environment, half elegance, half squalor, that the children came of age. Each child was a fragment of a different story, and together they formed a pattern that no one could explain. 2 of them belonged to wealthy Creole families, children of lawyers and landowners, expected to inherit fine educations and respectable futures. Another was the son of a German immigrant carpenter, a boy whose hands were already marked with splinters from helping his father in the workshop. The youngest was a girl from an Irish family, her father lost to cholera, her mother working as a laundress. The other 2 came from families who lived at the edge of the city, near the swampland itself. Families that had always been regarded as half strange, living too close to the water, too attuned to its rhythms. In ordinary times, such children would have had little cause to meet, much less form the kind of bond that was later described as unbreakable. Yet in the months before the disappearance, parish records, diaries, and fragments of testimony all suggest the same strange reality. They were drawn together as though by an invisible hand. Neighbors recalled seeing them in odd places, far from their usual routes. The Irish girl, who had once been timid and easily frightened, was spotted in the company of the Creole boys near the cemetery gates, tracing symbols in the dust with a stick. The carpenter's son was overheard humming in a language no one recognized, though his family insisted he had never learned more than broken English and his father's German. Teachers at the parish school described moments of distraction when the children would stare past the walls, their gazes fixed on something unseen. One wrote of a day when the six were caught whispering together in the courtyard, their voices so low it seemed less like speech than a kind of chanting. And then came the drawings. Preserved in fragments within parish archives are sketches attributed to the children, crude images of swamps, cypress trees bent low, and water rippling outward as though disturbed by unseen forces. One page shows a line of stick figures, small, childlike bodies, standing hand in hand at the edge of what appears to be a dark pool. Another page depicts a woman with long, flowing hair, her body merging into the water itself, eyes drawn as empty circles. Though the drawings could easily be dismissed as childish imagination, what disturbed parents and priests alike was their consistency. The children drew these figures separately, yet the images echoed one another. Sleepwalking was another theme whispered among families. The Irish mother claimed she once woke in the night to find her daughter standing barefoot in the yard, staring toward the distant swamp, with her lips moving soundlessly. A Creole father reported his son had wandered out of the house in the dark, unresponsive, eyes glazed as though in a trance. Several parents turned to priests for guidance, fearing possession or the influence of spirits. Confessions were filled with dread, and warnings were issued from pulpits about the dangers of ignoring old legends. For in New Orleans, folklore was never far from daily life. Among the Creole population, tales of the loup-garou, the werewolf said to haunt the edges of civilization, persisted as warnings to children. Others spoke of the Dame Blanche, a spectral woman dressed in white who lured travelers to their deaths near water. Haitian communities carried their own traditions, whispers of spirits who claimed the innocent. These stories had always been dismissed by the educated elite as relics of superstition. Yet in the months before the children vanished, they gained new traction. Parishioners began to murmur that the swamp itself was hungry, that it had been too long since it had taken a sacrifice. Priests gave sermons urging families to pray harder, to cleanse their homes with holy water, and to guard their children well. Yet physicians and city officials dismissed the rumors. They pointed instead to fever, to the psychological effects of malaria, to the hysteria that often gripped families living on the margins. Delirium, they said, could explain both the strange behavior and the unsettling drawings. Poverty, grief, and disease combined to create hallucinations in fragile minds. One doctor wrote in his notes that the swamp exerts a pressure on the imagination of children, and they respond with symptoms of a collective neurosis. He urged parents not to feed tales of spirits, lest they worsen the sickness, but his reassurances did little to calm the fear that spread across neighborhoods. What is perhaps most unsettling is that, despite differences in class and culture, the six children sought one another out, again and again. They were spotted by neighbors at the edge of the French market, sitting together in silence. They were seen near the levee, staring out over the river as though expecting something to rise from it. One account tells of them being discovered at the swamp's edge, their hands clasped tightly, standing in a row without speaking. A passerby called out, but none of the children turned. Only when the sound of church bells rang across the fields did they finally break apart, scattering in different directions. Parents grew uneasy, some forbidding their children to leave the house. Yet the pull seemed too strong. The carpenter's wife described her son begging to go outside at night, insisting that she was calling them. When pressed, he refused to say who she was. Another mother admitted her daughter had begun singing songs in her sleep, songs with no recognizable words, but with melodies that felt ancient, as though lifted from the soil itself. It is here that the lines of contrast become sharpest. To the rational mind, these were signs of illness, of fever-induced delirium, or perhaps even of simple childhood fancy. Children had always played games, invented imaginary figures, and drawn strange pictures. Yet to those steeped in folklore, the pattern was unmistakable. It was said that the swamp lured the innocent by whispering their names, by showing them visions of what lay beneath the water's surface. Once a child heard the call, the legends claimed they could not resist. They would return again and again until finally they stepped fully into its depths. By late August of 1838, the fear had reached a breaking point. Families whispered in their kitchens, warning one another not to let children wander near the bayou. Priests increased their visits, sprinkling homes with holy water. Yet the signs persisted. On several occasions, groups of adults swore they saw the children together, walking in a line through the streets as though on a pilgrimage. Their steps were synchronized, their eyes vacant. Some said they looked like sleepwalkers. Others said they looked like followers of a ritual older than the city itself. What no one could deny was the strange unity that bound them. These children, who by all accounts should have been divided by class, language, and culture, had become inseparable. The city itself seemed to notice, for whispers spread from the French Quarter to the waterfront. The six were being drawn into something beyond human comprehension. And then came the final sighting. Days before their disappearance, a farmer claimed he saw the children at the swamp's edge, their hands clasped together in a perfect chain. They stood facing the water in silence, unmoving as if awaiting instruction. The farmer, unnerved, watched for several minutes before calling out. None of the children stirred. He later confessed that a sudden chill ran through him, a sensation so deep that he turned away rather than approach them. When he looked back, the children were gone. This was the last known moment before they vanished completely. The city was left with fragments, diaries, drawings, whispered songs, and the chilling memory of six figures standing hand in hand before the swamp. The contrast between explanations remained unresolved. Parents blamed fever, priests warned of spirits, and doctors insisted on madness. But beneath all these theories lay the simple, inescapable truth. The children had been touched by something. Whether it was illness, imagination, or something far darker, no one could agree. What remains even now is the image that closes this chapter and leads us into the heart of the mystery. Six children, from different corners of New Orleans, bound together by an unseen force, walking hand in hand toward the edge of the bayou. The day of the disappearance began like so many others in late September, heavy, suffocating, and restless. The air was thick with humidity, a wet heat that clung to the skin and made every breath feel shallow. In New Orleans, such weather was nothing unusual, but those who later reflected on that evening would insist there was something different about it, something almost oppressive, as if the swamp itself had exhaled and laid its weight upon the city. Families went about their routines with the sluggishness that only endless summer heat can produce, unaware that by nightfall, a shadow would descend over their homes and never be lifted. The six children had been seen throughout the day. Witnesses recalled them moving about in pairs or small groups, drifting between neighborhoods in ways that seemed aimless, yet oddly purposeful. A fruit vendor remembered the eldest boy staring into a basket of apples, unmoving, as if lost in some inner vision, while his companions tugged gently at his sleeve. A washerwoman near the river claimed she saw them walking hand in hand, their heads tilted slightly upward, as though listening to something carried on the breeze. None of these accounts seemed unusual at the time. Children wandered, children played, but in retrospect, every detail took on new meaning. Every glance, every silence, every small peculiarity was revisited again and again as families sought to make sense of what came after. It was in the late afternoon, when the light began to change and the horizon grew hazy, that the children were last seen in the streets of the city. By the time church bells rang for evening prayers, they had vanished. At first, no one noticed. Parents assumed they were lingering at a neighbor's home or playing somewhere nearby. But as twilight deepened and the air filled with the sound of insects rising in chorus, unease began to spread. One by one, mothers stepped out into the streets calling their children's names. Fathers lit lanterns and walked the length of their yards. Neighbors leaned from doorways listening. The calls carried into the dusk, growing louder, more desperate until the truth began to settle. None of the six children had come home. Panic spread quickly. By nightfall, search parties had formed. Men carried torches and lanterns, their light flickering against the sagging walls and dirt roads of the poorer districts, while others fanned out toward the swamp's edge. Dogs were brought to sniff for trails, though several handlers later testified that the animals balked at the reeds, whining and pulling back as if confronted with some invisible barrier. The air was alive with shouts, the sloshing of boots in mud, the rustle of lanterns sweeping through undergrowth. Yet the swamp swallowed it all, offering nothing in return. Hours stretched into the dead of night. Mothers collapsed into sobs, clinging to one another, while priests moved among them offering hurried prayers. Fathers returned again and again to the swamp's edge, scanning the water with their lanterns, convinced they would spot some sign of movement. But there was nothing, only the dark expanse of reeds, the gleam of moonlight on still water, and the ever-present hum of insects. As dawn broke, exhaustion set in. Men slumped against trees, their torches burned down to stubs, while women sat with their heads in their hands. The children were gone. What came next was the discovery that would sear itself into memory. On the second day of searching, a group of men pushing deeper into the bayou stumbled upon a clearing. There, just at the edge where solid ground dissolved into water, they found them. Not the children, but their shoes. 6 small pairs, mud-streaked and worn, arranged in a nearly perfect line. The placement was deliberate. too neat to have been left by chance. Each pair was set side by side, toes pointing toward the swamp, as though the children had paused together, removed them, and stepped forward barefoot into the reeds. But the ground beyond told no story. There were no footprints in the mud, no broken stems, no indication of bodies dragged or carried away. It was as if the children had simply ceased to exist the moment they left their shoes behind. The discovery sent shockwaves through the searchers. Some crossed themselves and whispered prayers, convinced that what they saw was a sign of ritual, of sacrifice. Others examined the shoes with trembling hands, desperate to believe there must be some logical explanation. But logic faltered against the neatness of the display, the absence of any trail. In the days that followed, the shoes became a symbol. Mothers clutched at them when returned, kissing the leather as if by holding them they could summon their children back. Priests held them aloft during sermons, declaring them evidence of supernatural forces at work. For the city, they became the first tangible proof of the nightmare that had taken hold. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed the children had been chosen by the swamp, that the arrangement of shoes mirrored tales told by elders, old folk tales in which the bayou demanded tribute and took its victims in silence. These stories, passed down from French and Haitian traditions, told of spirits who lured children to the water's edge, bidding them leave behind the trappings of the human world before vanishing forever. In these tales, there were never bodies, never remains, only absence. To those who believed, the shoes were confirmation that myth had bled into reality, but others scoffed. Rationalists, both in the medical community and among the city's leadership, argued that the children had likely drowned, pulled under by hidden currents, or devoured by animals that left little trace. Some even suggested quicksand, pointing to the swamp's deceptive terrain. Yet these explanations rang hollow when set against the facts. If the children had drowned, why had no bodies surfaced? Why had not a single shred of clothing, not a ribbon, not a scrap of fabric washed back onto the shore? If they had been attacked by animals, why were there no drag marks, no torn garments, no splashes of blood in the mud? And if quicksand had swallowed them whole, how had 6 children of varying ages and sizes all found themselves in the same trap at once, and without leaving the chaos of struggle behind? The more the officials insisted on reason, the more locals whispered of darker truths. The swamp was alive, they said. It was not just water and reeds, but something with intention, something capable of hunger. The children had been claimed, not lost. The neat line of shoes was not an accident, but a message. Families clung to these interpretations, not because they wished to believe in horror, but because horror at least provided meaning. To accept the rational explanations was, paradoxically, to accept senselessness. To believe in the swamp's appetite was to believe that their children's disappearance had purpose, however dreadful. For weeks, the search continued. Men dragged nets through the water, dredging up nothing but mud and reeds. Volunteers combed every path, every thicket. Lanterns swung through the night, casting eerie shadows across the water's surface. And always the same result, nothing. The swamp gave up no secrets. Dogs continued to refuse entry, trembling at the threshold. Some men claimed to hear faint sounds as they searched, snatches of laughter, the distant echo of children's voices carried on the wind. But no source was ever found. Others reported seeing movement in the reeds, shapes that vanished when approached. Such testimonies were dismissed as tricks of fatigue, the imagination of men pushed to the brink. Yet the stories persisted, adding another layer of dread to the mystery. Months passed. Autumn gave way to winter, and still the families waited. Some kept lamps burning in their windows, believing light might guide their children home. Others refused to speak of them at all, as though silence could protect the memory from further corruption. Priests urged their congregations to accept God's will, while doctors doubled down on rational explanations. But beneath the surface of sermons and speeches, the same unease lingered. 6 children had vanished, leaving behind only shoes. The disappearance became more than a local tragedy. It became a story the city could not stop telling. In markets and taverns, people lowered their voices and spoke of the children, of the night they walked into the swamp. Sailors carried the tale down the river, spreading it to other ports where it grew with each retelling. Some versions claimed the children had been seen afterward, walking across the water like saints or spirits. Others insisted they had been taken underground, into caverns beneath the swamp where no human dared to tread. Every telling added new layers, but the core remained unchanged. 6 children, gone without trace, their trail ending in silence. For investigators, the most unsettling conclusion was also the simplest. When asked what evidence had been found, one search leader replied grimly, The trail ended. It simply ended. There was no continuation, no sign of struggle, no direction left to follow. To speak those words was to admit a possibility no one wished to face, that the children had not simply gone missing, but had crossed into a space beyond human reach. Whether that space was death, myth, or something unnameable, no one could say. And so the city was left with absence, empty beds, silent yards. The sound of names called into the swamp with no answer. The line of shoes preserved in memory became the final image of innocence undone, of a mystery too vast for reason alone. Some said the swamp had opened its mouth and swallowed them. Others said they had been taken by human hands, into darkness deeper than water. But whichever story one chose, the outcome was the same. 6 children had walked into the swamp, and nothing of them had ever returned. In the months following the disappearance, the city of New Orleans found itself divided, not merely in grief but in interpretation. The event had ruptured the normal order of things, leaving an emptiness that demanded explanation. And explanations came readily, though they often stood in sharp opposition. For some, the answer lay in science, in the rational frameworks of medicine and natural philosophy that were slowly gaining influence in the 1830s. For others, the truth could only be found in the realm of superstition, in the stories and beliefs that had been carried across oceans and preserved in whispers for generations. What resulted was not merely a debate, but a cultural collision: science versus superstition, reason versus faith, skepticism against the enduring pull of myth. The physicians of 1838 approached the disappearance with the measured authority of their profession. They dismissed notions of spirits and curses, insisting instead that the children had been overtaken by some natural but poorly understood affliction. One of the leading theories put forward was malaria, the infamous swamp fever that haunted Louisiana in those years. The disease was rampant, spread by mosquitoes long before the vector was scientifically confirmed, and its symptoms were both frightening and unpredictable. Fever, delirium, hallucinations, disorientation. It was easy to imagine, they argued, that the children had been gripped by feverish visions, compelled into the swamp in a state of madness. A similar theory pointed toward ergot poisoning, the contamination of rye and other grains with a fungus that produced strange and terrifying effects. The idea was not far-fetched. Ergotism had been blamed in earlier centuries for outbreaks of convulsions and hallucinations in Europe, and some even connected it to the infamous witch trials in Salem. If bread in a household had been tainted, perhaps the children ate of it and suffered a shared delirium. Physicians described how ergot could induce not only visions but also compulsions, feelings of being led or pulled by unseen forces. The neat arrangement of shoes, then, might have been an artifact of shared mania, an inexplicable gesture carried out under the grip of poisoned minds. Other medical men spoke of mass hysteria, a term that was just beginning to enter discussion. Children, they reasoned, were impressionable. If one saw something unusual, the others might imitate it. If one felt compelled to step into the swamp, the others might follow without question. To these doctors, the tragedy was an accident of psychology, the unfortunate alignment of fragile minds caught in a moment of contagion. From the vantage point of modern psychology, additional explanations would later be suggested. Scholars have proposed ideas like collective dissociation, in which a group withdraws into a shared psychological state, detaching from reality in unison. Others invoke trauma response, where fear or stress might drive children into irrational flight, their actions incomprehensible to the adults left behind. Contemporary thinkers point to the thin line between environment and mind, the heavy heat, the humidity, the constant drone of insects, as factors that could induce altered states of consciousness. To stand at the swamp's edge, body exhausted, mind fevered, could indeed make one feel that the water was calling. Yet if the rationalists had their arsenal of theories, the city's folk traditions offered another framework altogether, one that could not be dismissed so easily in 1838. Louisiana was, after all, a place where cultures intermingled in complex, layered ways. French Creole families carried with them tales from Europe, while Haitian immigrants brought Vodou beliefs shaped by West African cosmologies. Enslaved Africans and their descendants preserved spiritual traditions that intertwined with Catholic imagery, creating a vibrant, if often misunderstood, religious landscape. In such a place, superstition was not peripheral, it was central. Among the tales told in hushed tones after the children vanished was that of the loup-garou, the Cajun werewolf. This creature, said to haunt the bayous, was not merely a beast of fur and fang but a cursed man, doomed to wander the swamps until redemption or death. The loup-garou was believed to prey especially upon children, luring them away from safety and into the darkness. Parents had long used the tale as a warning: obey your elders, stay close to home, or the loup-garou will take you. When the 6 children disappeared, some whispered that the warning had come true, that a loup-garou had risen from the reeds and claimed them as his own. Others spoke of the Dame Blanche, the White Lady, a spectral woman dressed in pale garments who appeared near water. French folklore described her as a spirit who lured travelers with her beauty or her voice, demanding dances or favors, punishing those who refused. Transplanted into Louisiana, the tale transformed. The Dame Blanche became a figure who haunted swamps and riversides, her call irresistible to children. Some mothers insisted that their sons and daughters had spoken of hearing a woman's voice in the nights leading up to the disappearance, a gentle singing that drifted through open shutters. If true, then perhaps the children had not been delirious but enchanted, summoned by a force older than medicine could name. Haitian traditions added further dimensions. In Vodou belief, spirits known as LWA could inhabit or guide individuals, sometimes drawing them into trances. Stories told of water spirits, entities who dwelled beneath the surface and demanded offerings. Rituals at the time often involved leaving gifts, candles, food, even personal belongings at the water's edge to appease such forces. For families who carried these beliefs, the line of shoes discovered near the swamp took on terrifying clarity. Were the children offering themselves? Had they been claimed as a living sacrifice by spirits hungry for devotion? The neatness of the shoes resembled ritual more than accident, aligning all too well with remembered practices. These competing explanations played out not just in homes but in public life. Priests from the Catholic Church condemned the superstitious accounts, warning their congregations against falling into pagan lies. Physicians published letters in local papers, citing medical literature and pleading for rational calm. But at the same time, gatherings in the poorer quarters told a different story. Women lit candles at crossroads. Men whispered of curses. Children were kept inside after sunset, not because of fever but because of the loup-garou. The tension between science and superstition was not merely academic, it was visceral. Families were torn between 2 modes of understanding. A mother might sit in a church pew on Sunday, hearing a sermon about God's will and the dangers of folk tales, then return home to leave a bowl of milk at her doorstep in hope of appeasing restless spirits. A father might attend a meeting with physicians who lectured on fevers, then dream that night of a white lady beckoning him from the reeds. The boundaries between belief and reason blurred in the fog of grief. And yet, for all the theories put forward, malaria, ergotism, hysteria, loup-garou, Dame Blanche, none could fully account for the mystery. Rational explanations stumbled over the physical evidence. If the children were fevered or hallucinating, why had their shoes been so deliberately arranged? Children in delirium do not pause to line their belongings in ritual symmetry. If it was simple disease, why only these 6 and not others in their households? Why, after months of searching, was there no trace of bodies, no scraps of clothing, nothing returned by the water? Superstitious explanations, too, faltered against the details. If a loup-garou had taken them, why was there no sign of struggle? The werewolf of Cajun lore was a creature of violence. It did not persuade its victims to remove their shoes politely. If the Dame Blanche had sung them away, why was the evidence so material, so tangible in the mud at the swamp's edge? Spirits rarely leave behind neat lines of leather. The folklore provided frameworks of meaning, but even believers struggled to reconcile them with the stark reality of what had been found. This failure of both camps, science and superstition, was perhaps the most unsettling truth of all. Each explanation held elements of plausibility, yet each collapsed under scrutiny. The physicians could not find bodies. The storytellers could not account for the shoes. What remained was a void, a silence that no narrative could fill. In that silence, fear thrived. The swamp itself seemed to resist classification, refusing to bend entirely to either microscope or myth. As years passed, the debate did not fade but deepened. Later generations of doctors revisited the case, proposing new variations of old theories: psychological contagion, dissociative episodes, environmental toxins. Folklorists collected the tales that sprang from the disappearance, documenting the way communities used myth to make sense of horror. Yet even these efforts could not close the wound. The event remained poised on the knife's edge between science and superstition, never belonging wholly to one or the other. And perhaps that was the truest legacy of the children's disappearance. It forced the city to confront the limits of its understanding. Science could not yet pierce every mystery, and superstition could not explain every fact. Between the two yawned a gulf, deep and dark as the swamp itself. Into that gulf, 6 children had vanished, leaving behind only silence, and shoes that seemed to belong as much to ritual as to reason. The disappearance of the 6 children in 1838 might have seemed at first like an event destined to fade into rumor and silence. Yet silence was not what followed. In the years, and even the decades after, voices emerged. Broken, fragmented, sometimes inconsistent, but voices nonetheless. They belonged to those left behind, brothers and sisters, grieving mothers and fathers, neighbors whose memories refused to die, and later, strangers who claimed to have brushed against the mystery in uncanny ways. Each testimony added another layer to the haunting, a collage of sorrow and fear. If the children themselves were gone, their absence spoke through others, echoing in half-remembered moments, in whispers carried down the generations. These accounts form not only the emotional core of the tragedy, but also its most unsettling dimension, for they blur the line between grief-born invention and encounters with the inexplicable. Among the earliest testimonies came from a boy of 8, the younger brother of one of the vanished. Decades later, in an interview preserved in the archives of a parish newspaper, he recalled a sound from that September night. His parents had put him to bed, but sleep refused to come. Through the open shutters, he swore he heard voices, not the familiar tones of his sister or her companions, but something else, layered and strange. It was singing, he said, though no words I knew, like a church hymn sung in a tongue forgotten. The sound drifted from the direction of the swamp. He remembered hiding under his blanket, terrified until dawn. To skeptics, this was the blurred recollection of a traumatized child, colored by fear and years of retelling. But to others, it resonated too closely with the old stories of enchantments and spectral calls. If indeed voices rose from the swamp that night, whose were they? Another testimony came from one of the mothers herself. Weeks before the disappearance, she claimed, her daughter had spoken of the woman made of water. At first, the mother dismissed it as childish fantasy, the sort of imaginative play common to children. Yet after the vanishing, her recollection took on a darker cast. In her grief, she swore that her daughter had been describing something real, a figure glimpsed near the cypress trees, glistening as if sculpted from the swamp's own waters. The child had insisted that the woman was calling them, beckoning them toward something beautiful. She said it was not frightening, the mother recalled. She said it felt like home. In her sorrow, the mother interpreted this not as imagination but as forewarning, a sign she had failed to recognize. To hear her speak was to witness the anguish of a parent who would forever wonder if she had ignored the one clue that might have saved her child. Neighbors, too, carried fragments of memory. One woman remembered seeing the children together, days before they disappeared, standing at the swamp's edge with their hands clasped. She described how still they had been, how intent their gazes were upon the water. It was as if they were listening, she said, waiting for something none of us could hear. She had called out to them, but they did not respond. In hindsight, she interpreted the moment as eerie, unnatural. Yet when she first saw it, she thought only that children were playing some strange game. Testimonies like hers added to the sense that something had drawn the children collectively, a force invisible to adult eyes, but irresistible to theirs. But not all accounts were immediate. Some arose decades later, from those who had no direct connection to the families. In 1872, a fisherman claimed to have seen figures in the swamp on a fog-laden night. They were childlike, pale and half-submerged, standing waist-deep in the water. When he called out, they did not move. He rowed closer, and as the mist thinned, the figures dissolved before his eyes. He insisted they were not hallucinations, not tricks of light. Others dismissed his story, accusing him of drink or invention. Yet the tale spread quickly, reinforced by similar claims over the years. More than one fisherman swore to seeing small shapes moving silently in the reeds, too tall for birds, too slender for beasts. To those who believed, the swamp was not merely water and earth, it was a graveyard, holding its lost children in forms glimpsed only in passing. The psychological toll on survivors was immense. Mothers wasted away in grief, some withdrawing entirely from society. A few were said to wander the swamp themselves, lanterns in hand, calling the names of their children long into the night. Fathers, torn between despair and rage, sometimes directed their anger at one another, blaming poverty, negligence, or superstition. Religious leaders offered interpretations grounded in theology. The disappearances, they preached, were divine punishment for sins of pride, greed, or the mingling of forbidden beliefs. For some, This explanation provided a grim solace, the thought that God had claimed the children rather than some nameless horror. For others, it only deepened the torment, casting them as guilty in their own children's deaths. The psychological literature of today might categorize such testimonies as examples of survivor's memory distortion. In moments of extreme grief, the mind reshapes reality, crafting visions and voices that offer a semblance of meaning. False memories, researchers explain, are not lies but desperate attempts of the brain to weave coherence from trauma. Yet the eerie consistency of certain motifs, singing voices, spectral figures, the pull of the swamp, troubles such reduction. Are these similarities merely products of shared culture, the repetition of folklore until it manifests in imagination? Or do they point to something deeper, a phenomenon not so easily explained away, religious interpretations layered onto the trauma in complex ways? Catholic priests counseled that the children's souls had likely been taken by demons, warning parents to abandon superstitions and cling only to the church. Protestant ministers, fewer in number but vocal, suggested the event was proof of divine wrath upon a city steeped in vice. Yet alongside these sermons, in quiet corners of the community, other rituals unfolded. Families of Haitian descent lit candles for the LWA, hoping to appease water spirits. Creole women left bread and salt near the swamp's edge, whispering prayers not found in scripture. These rituals, whether born of desperation or conviction, suggest that belief in the supernatural endured not as mere story, but as a coping mechanism, a way to speak to forces too large for human understanding. Over time, the accounts extended beyond those who had been directly connected. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, travelers to the region wrote of hearing locals call that stretch of swamp the children's grave without graves. The phrase carried a haunting weight, emphasizing the absence of bodies, the lack of closure. Generations of families refused to build homes nearby, even as the city expanded. To them, the land itself had been poisoned by the event, forever marked by the children's absence. One oral history recalls a family who, upon inheriting property near the swamp, refused to set foot upon it, declaring that the ground eats what is given. Psychological trauma lingered, manifesting across generations. Descendants of the families sometimes reported dreams in which children appeared, barefoot and silent, leading them toward dark water. Such dreams could be dismissed as inherited stories, the subconscious echo of family lore. Yet those who experienced them often described them with a terror too sharp to be mere legend. One woman, writing in 1925, confessed that she woke from such a dream unable to breathe, convinced she had been standing in the swamp itself. It felt, she wrote, as though the mud had closed around my ankles. Such accounts blur the distinction between memory and haunting, between psychological inheritance and supernatural persistence. In analyzing these testimonies, one cannot avoid the question, were they inventions born of grief or genuine encounters with something inexplicable? The contrast is stark. On one side lies the human mind, fragile and malleable, crafting illusions in the face of unbearable loss. On the other lies the possibility of the swamp itself as a locus of forces beyond comprehension, drawing survivors into brushes with an unseen world. To dismiss the accounts entirely is to strip the tragedy of its human depth. To accept them fully is to step into a realm of mystery where evidence falters. What is certain is that the testimonies themselves became part of the legacy, shaping the way the disappearance was remembered. The younger brother's singing, the mother's watery woman, the fisherman's pale figures, all wove together into a tapestry of unease. The swamp ceased to be merely a geographical feature. It became a stage upon which memory, myth, and mourning played endlessly, replaying the disappearance not as a singular event but as a continuing presence. Survivors could never truly leave it behind, for their words anchored them to it, binding their grief to the land itself. Even into the 20th century, these stories endured. Newspapers occasionally revisited the case, recounting the accounts with a mixture of skepticism and fascination. Folklorists documented them, debating whether they represented authentic cultural expressions or embellishments over time. Locals, however, needed no such debates. For them, the swamp remained the children's resting place, though without bodies, without graves. They did not enter it lightly. Hunters skirted its edges. Farmers refused to plow its soil. Children were warned never to wander too close. It was a space both ordinary and sacred, a wound in the land that never healed. And so the testimonies, whether shaped by imagination or mystery, left an indelible mark. They transformed the disappearance from an isolated tragedy into a haunting legend. For every rationalist who dismissed them as false memory, there was another who shuddered at the consistency, the persistence, the refusal of the voices to die. The accounts may not provide answers, but they ensure the question remains alive. What happened to the children who walked into the swamp and never returned? Were the survivors merely speaking from grief, or were they bearing witness to something that continues to ripple through the swamp's waters? By the end of the century, the families had dispersed, some fleeing the city altogether, others remaining but never daring to live near the cursed stretch. Yet the memory lingered, stitched into the fabric of the community. And even today, when the wind rattles the cypress trees and fog settles over the bayou, some locals still speak the old phrase with a shiver, "the children's grave without graves." As the years lengthened and the children never returned, explanations proliferated. The swamp's silence was unbearable, and so people filled it with words, theories, and myths. Some clung to rational accounts, convinced the tragedy was born of human cruelty. Others leaned toward the supernatural, insisting no earthly explanation could account for what had happened. And in between, countless variations flourished, each one reflecting the anxieties, prejudices, and longings of the people who repeated them. What is striking is not merely the number of theories, but their persistence. Nearly 2 centuries later, the story still invites debate. Perhaps it always will, for the case seems designed to resist resolution, to remain poised between the possible and the impossible. One of the most enduring rational theories was abduction. New Orleans in 1838 was a city marked by both opulence and crime. Wealthy Creole families lived in lavish townhouses, while docks swarmed with sailors, traders, and drifters. The city's status as a major port made it a crossroads, and wherever transients thrived, so too did lawlessness. Some suggested that the children had been taken by a traveling criminal, someone who preyed upon the vulnerable and disappeared into the wilderness before authorities could respond. In this version, the shoes neatly arranged at the swamp's edge were a staging, evidence planted by the abductor to confuse pursuers or mimic local legends. Yet skeptics of this theory point out its weakness. Abductors leave traces. Struggles, footprints, or dropped possessions usually mark their passage. But in this case, the trail simply ended. Another rational explanation drew upon the darker undercurrents of antebellum New Orleans: human trafficking. The city was a hub of the slave trade, but beyond its legal operations, illicit networks thrived, abducting free people of color and poor immigrants to sell into bondage. Children, small and impressionable, could be targets. According to this theory, the swamp served as cover. The abductors marched the children only far enough to leave their shoes behind, then spirited them elsewhere. Some argued that the deliberate removal of footwear was part of a tactic to prevent pursuit, as barefoot children would leave fewer tracks on wet ground. This account, grim and plausible, explains the absence of bodies, yet it falters when confronted with the ritual-like neatness of the shoes. Why align them so carefully, unless the act carried symbolic weight? Rationality struggles against the strangeness of that detail. Still darker were whispers of cult activity. Antebellum Louisiana was no stranger to secret societies, Masonic lodges, fraternal orders, and clandestine religious sects. Rumors spread that a hidden group had chosen the children for sacrifice, perhaps influenced by syncretic rituals blending Catholicism, voodoo, and European mysticism. The swamp, isolated and impenetrable, would have provided the perfect setting for such rites. The theory gained traction decades later, when a diary surfaced from a local man who wrote cryptically of the offering of 6 and the river that swallows. Though historians doubt the diary's authenticity, its existence stoked imaginations. Could the children have been victims of a human conspiracy, cloaked in the language of ritual? Or was this explanation itself a myth, constructed to project human agency onto something that defied comprehension? Beyond the rational, mythic interpretations abounded. The swamp, in local imagination, was not inert land but a living presence, a breathing entity that could demand payment. In this view, the disappearance was not crime but sacrifice, whether voluntary or compelled. Some said the swamp claimed the children to balance a debt, perhaps incurred by the sins of their families or the corruption of the city. Others insisted the swamp chose them because of their innocence, purity required for whatever dark covenant governed its waters. The neat arrangement of shoes, then, was not evidence of human planning but the swamp's own ritual, a signature of its hunger. Legends from the Creole and Cajun communities spoke of swamp spirits that lured children. The loup-garou, long feared, was said to curse those who disobeyed elders, but in some tales it could also charm its victims into following willingly. The Dame Blanche, spectral and luminous, was often described as standing near rivers or marshes, her song irresistible. Both figures overlap with the testimonies of survivors who reported singing voices and a woman made of water. If such entities were real, or even if belief in them shaped perception, they could explain why the children seemed to walk calmly, hand in hand into the bayou. They were not dragged or chased. They went as though called. Vodou traditions added another layer. Water spirits like La Sirène, a mermaid-like figure, were revered as powerful El Beloué. Devotees offered gifts at riverbanks to earn her favor. In some rituals, initiates were said to go under the water symbolically, returning with altered destinies. Could the children's disappearance have echoed such practices, whether through imitation, accident, or genuine spiritual intervention? If so, then their shoes, carefully left behind, might be seen as offerings rather than mere objects. To believers, this possibility transformed the tragedy into a story of possession and passage rather than abduction or death. The idea of the swamp as a living entity itself gained power over time. Writers described it as an open mouth, a place that swallowed without trace. Hunters spoke of sudden sinkholes, places where the earth seemed to liquefy and consume anything above. Some theorized that the children stumbled into such a place, vanishing instantly beneath the mud. But while sinkholes could explain disappearance, they could not account for the shoes, nor for the eerie stillness of the trail. Thus, even when couched in natural terms, the swamp remained uncanny, resisting neat categorization. Each theory reflected broader cultural tensions. To suggest abduction or trafficking was to confront human corruption, the cruelty of a city profiting from exploitation. To suggest spirits or curses was to affirm faith in forces beyond human comprehension. To suggest the swamp itself acted was to acknowledge nature's power over fragile lives. The debate, therefore, became not only about what happened to 6 children, but about what kind of world New Orleans believed itself to inhabit. One governed by human evil, supernatural justice, or the raw indifference of the land. Rhetorical questions punctuated every telling. Were the children lured, or did they go willingly? Did they vanish because of one man's cruelty, or because of a curse carried across oceans? Were their shoes the cruel staging of a criminal mind, or the symbolic signature of a spirit demanding devotion? Why did the swamp search so thoroughly give back nothing? Why, even after years of speculation, does the trail still end in silence? The strength of the story lies in how no single theory satisfies. Abduction explains human agency but not ritual order. Trafficking accounts for disappearance but not silence. Cult activity aligns with symbols but lacks evidence. Superstition resonates with testimonies but falters before physical facts. The swamp as entity explains absorption but not the deliberate shoes. Each framework holds part of the truth, yet each collapses under scrutiny. The case resists resolution as though designed to remain open. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the theories themselves became myth. Families repeated them not as possibilities but as inheritances, stories that defined how they understood danger, loss, and the unknown. For some, the tragedy was a cautionary tale about human wickedness. For others, it was proof that the supernatural remained near. And for many, it was both at once, evidence that innocence can be devoured by cruelty, whether human or otherworldly. Even today, when one stands at the swamp's edge, the weight of those theories lingers. The air hums with insects, the water reflects only darkness, and the cypress trees rise like sentinels. One cannot help but wonder, what truly happened on that September evening in 1838? Did the children stumble into the hands of men, or into the arms of spirits? Did they die swiftly, or do they linger still as some claim to see them in misty nights? Theories abound, myths endure, but the truth remains submerged. Perhaps that is why the story continues to haunt. In its uncertainty lies its power. The case leaves us not with answers, but with a crescendo of questions, each one reverberating like an echo through the swamp. Was this tragedy born of human evil, or something far beyond comprehension? The swamp lies quiet now, as it has for nearly 2 centuries, its surface a mirror of black water broken only by the occasional ripple that has no visible cause. Moonlight drapes itself across the cypress trees, turning their twisted forms into silhouettes that seem half human, half monument, and the air carries that heavy stillness that arrives only in the late hours of night, when the world itself appears to hold its breath. It is in this hush that the story of the vanished children lingers most vividly, for the silence of the swamp has never been a neutral thing. It has always carried memory, rumor, and fear in its depths. We return to the paradox at the heart of the case. It stands balanced at the crossroads of psychology and superstition, reason and myth, human cruelty and natural mystery. never yielding fully to any explanation offered. The unanswered details persist like thorns in the mind. Why were the 6 children drawn together in the first place, united across boundaries of class and neighborhood, acting in harmony when their lives otherwise shared so little? Why were their shoes, small and fragile, found arranged in that meticulous ritual-like line, and yet not a single footprint pointed farther inward? Why did the swamp, searched with dogs and lanterns, give up no bodies, no clothing, no trace of life or death? And why, decades later, did so many continue to swear that they heard voices in the reeds, songs without singers, laughter without children, whispers carried on fog? These fragments of evidence refuse to resolve into certainty. They hang like fragments of a dream that can never be pieced together. Perhaps the truth died with them, swallowed by mud and water, extinguished in a single moment of disappearance. Or perhaps it did not die at all. Perhaps it lingers still in the swamp, hidden in its endless chambers of shadow and sound, waiting for those who dare to listen too closely. For in the end, the question cannot be answered so much as it must be lived with, haunting in its persistence. Were the children victims of madness, myth, or malevolence? Did they step willingly into another realm, or were they pulled into darkness by unseen hands? Was their fate human, supernatural, or something beyond even those categories? The story does not grant us clarity, only the disquiet of possibility. And so the swamp itself remains the final character in this tale, silent, watchful, enduring, its waters holding secrets too deep to name. To stand at its edge is to feel both the weight of history and the pull of something older than history, something that reminds us how fragile the boundary between the known and the unknown truly is. The question is left to you now, to carry in your own silence. What do you believe?